we're going to take a little break from more of the traditional presentations to have an opportunity to do some learning, but hopefully also, is that on my phone adjusting? Here we go. Sorry, my phone is not on silent. To give you an opportunity to see how you might use some materials or just practice using some social studies methods ourselves. So a lot of this stems from a course I teach on inclusive classrooms for immigrant students, because immigration is a big module that we do, and obviously it's laden with complexities, and often that deters people from learning more about it or trying to understand it. So what we're going to start out with is really just a bit of brainstorming of kind of, okay, what do we know? What do we need to sort through and make sure that our background knowledge is there? So I'm going to put, I'll put this link in the Padlet. I didn't share the presentation because some of it I didn't want you to jump into right away, but in the chat, I'm going to put the link to the Padlet, and let me know if you can't get in. But really what I want us to start out talking about is just US citizenship. What comes to mind right away? What do we know? What are the pathways? What's entailed? Because of course, even though we're talking about the role of whiteness in citizenship policies, that's going to imply immigration and naturalization and things like that. So so let's just chat citizenship. How do we get it? What do we know about the process that's entailed? Throw up a note on the Padlet when you get in there, or feel free to put it in the chat too. All right, so it takes a long process. Can someone elaborate on either just by talking as we talk through these things, waiting periods? So with this length of time, why is that? What do we need to use? What's entailed with the process that requires the time? Expensive, we'll talk about those fees too.
Just from some experience, I've heard that a lot of administrative backlogs happen. So some of it is out of their control and they want it to be faster, but unfortunately they don't have the control to make it faster.
Absolutely, thanks, Danny. So we'll chat about how, initial, there's, and I see natural born, right? So there is birthright as far as citizenship being guaranteed. We'll talk about that in a minute. But then the naturalization process, you first have to live in the US for 5 years, right under as a lawful permanent resident, so that you have a green card. And after those 5 years, you become eligible. And so from there, then you can start kind of that application process. And with the number of steps involved, each step, right, has some of those waiting periods and probably fees involved for traveling, not only applying, but traveling to these places to have them. Okay, so we also, I see somebody put up something about marriage too, right? So that being one path to citizenship as well. So it's either, so this is great. Thanks for jumping in and putting in what we know. And a lot of times it's kind of these general ideas too, right? You can't leave the US, so you have to be here for 5 consecutive or continuous, for most of the time has to be here, right? Or if you are, as we'll see, or if you are married to a US citizen, that's for 3 years, okay? So here are a few things, just some details of what's required, just to help us get thinking about citizenship and what we know about it right now. So trying to put it, pretty straightforward, again, thinking about how a lot of undergrads are processing these topics too. So you have to be 18 years of age or older, you have to be of good moral character. You have to have proof that your household income is 125% above the poverty line. Now, keep in mind that depends on the size of your household. So if you are single, sponsoring someone else, then your household is much smaller, right? Being then a proposed household of two, which may be easier to obtain, to make sure that you have that funding that you can prove. But if you're sponsoring more children or already have a bigger family, that's that fee, that basically savings account that you need to have is going to be larger. So just thinking about that. The N400 is the application. And I just realized this did not catch my attention. And that's the other reason for our chats today is that, in the last 4 years, especially of the Trump administration, a lot of news is missed because there are so many other headlines, right? So this is what we're also going to chat about today. But the fee has gone up 80% in 2020. So it was one of the biggest hikes. Some say that it's because it hadn't been hiked up in a long time. But anyway, that was something new for me in preparing for this, is that fee just went up 80%. So you have a biometrics appointment, you have an interview, which is where your English language proficiency is determined, and your citizenship test that a lot of people have heard about. So, okay, background of pathways to citizenship. And so we're thinking about that as kind of once you get to that naturalization process, but think about trying to get to the naturalization process. So you have to be sponsored or have a way of even getting in, right? Which is where, that integration with citizenship and immigration has to be understood. So there's birthright. There's, we have a primarily family-sponsored, family-based program for seeking citizenship. You could have a visa so that it is an employment-based visa, or you could be a refugee or an asylum seeker, an asylee. So I wanted to note that even though we will chat about some of these policies within our conversations, just remember that there is not a path to citizenship if you have temporary protection status or if you've filed for DACA. So just keeping all of these pieces in mind to think about all the different components of citizenship. So here's what I'm going to task you to do next, as again, we're just trying to, this is an infographic that goes out. I've seen it like all over the place in relation to immigration, but it tries to show the complexities of trying to navigate legal immigration. So you can come back to it when I share the presentation to see the different complexities of what has to happen in order to do it. And obviously a little bit biased in the way that they are trying to portray some of these things, but does help provide a bit of an understanding of the different ways to. Here we are going to go into, I've got a Jamboard, okay? So I need you again to be a little interactive right now. And I'm just gonna give you all, based on our participants, in seeing how many we have here. I'm just gonna give you a number and I want you to go to that slide, okay? So again, let me get the link in the chat. And I've got some directions for you that I will explain once this loads. Here we go. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. In the left column, all right, so right here, African Americans, when you see this column here, I want you to move these groups so that they are in order of which of these groups was granted citizenship. This is, again, just to explore your background knowledge, play around with it, but it's a lot more I could tell you, just look at it and guess. But I want you to try to manipulate them and put these in order of who has been granted citizenship. Second, task 2, is I want you to draw a line, okay? So you can just grab your pen and draw a line from the group to the law that granted that citizenship, okay? So again, not expecting you to know all of these whatsoever. And obviously you'll see that it's not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence, but just wanted to get your feet wet and just as a another way and slot these different laws and historical perspective lets you do it. So I've got 10 different slides here. I am glad you like Jamboards, Danny. And here we go. So here's the link. And as I look at our participants, I know we have 12, but that includes me, so not everybody might participate. I'm going by alphabetical order. So if you're gonna jump in and use these, I'm gonna say, Amy, you can have slide 1, Brandon, you can have slide 2, Brian, Scott, you can have slide 3, Cara, slide 4, Charlie, slide 5, Danny, slide 6, Dean, slide 7, Greg, slide 8, Kelly, slide 9, and Whitney, slide 10. So look at your participant list and you'll see it in alphabetical order. So starting with Amy, she's number 1. You can count from there which one to edit, all right? And we're not gonna be judging you based on what you know or what you do or how active you are in the Jamboard, but it's a way to start exploring what do we know about this historical context of citizenship. I'm gonna give you at least 5 minutes just to work on that or to think about it. Let's take a look. So I'm gonna go, who was number 6?
Thanks for singling me out, geez.
Yes. So Danny Anto, and again, just for the sake of time to make sure we stay on time, I would love for you all to share what you knew, but Danny has pinned it here because free white persons was first with the Nationality Act of 1790, okay? Then with the 14th Amendment, African Americans were granted citizenship, but then shortly thereafter, they specified to also extend to aliens of African nativity. So the naturalization piece beyond the birthright. But the important piece too here in the Naturalization Act of 1870 is that that specifically included white people now and African Americans, but no other non-white group, okay? So we're gonna be looking at some court cases in just a minute related to that. So later then we did get birthright through United States versus Wong Kim Ark in 1898. Then the Repatriation Act had taken away citizenship to women who married non-citizens, but was restored by the Cable Act. And then last, of course, ironically, right, is Native Americans born in the US were given citizenship by the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. I didn't want to put the date to just match that one up too easily. So thanks for playing along and going through, but hopefully again, this more so just gives you a quick crash course on some of the history behind it. What we want to start to explore, because we're already starting to see, is that race has played an important part in, or an influential role in being able to obtain citizenship. And so what I want us to do now is to look at where this really started to come into play. So where it was really challenged, this notion of whiteness, was in 2 consecutive court cases. In 1922, a Japanese man, Takao Ozawa was challenging, he was denied citizenship. And then a man thinned from India, also challenged, was trying to seek citizenship. So I've got some primary sources for you to look at. Yes, they are a little bit dense, but I think when, especially as you start to look for some of these keywords of white and whiteness, you're going to be able to pinpoint some of them. So if you get to these links that I will, again, I'm making it complex by not giving it away, but I highlight what you're going to take out of it in the next part. So if we take a look at this first case in the chat here. Thanks for bearing with me. There you can read about the first case, and here you can read about the second case. And again, I know they are dense, but we're reading for, kind of a specific purpose, so try to skim. And many of you are excellent at doing that. And I want you to think about, how is white defined in the Ozawa case and how is it defined in thinned? And then we'll chat about the key distinctions made in these rulings. All right, so I will give you again another 5 to 10 minutes to dive into that. Did I warn you I was going to make you do a lot of work?
Wow, Laura, that's
okay. So I know, a bit dense, right?
Yeah, that's real hard. I'm the mother of a daughter from China, and that was a hard court case to read.
It was, and I'm going to essentialize it just for the purposes of our time together today. But if you do note at the bottom of this slide, there is an extended lesson plan. It's at the secondary level, but here's a link to, if you wanted to use these particular court cases with your class to look at. But what I'm going to show us, and I've got a video to help bring up about these learnings. But what I want us to look at are these key definitions here. So in the 1922 Ozawa case, the term white person applies to anyone in this country known as white. So in the racial sense, which is equated to the Caucasian race. So therefore, a Japanese born in Japan is clearly not Caucasian, can't be a US citizen because they are not white. Okay, so it was really in this racial sense of you have to be white is to be Caucasian, and that's impossible for a Japanese person. In the thinned case, we see a different version or interpretation of Caucasian to basically start to say that, well, we know that they are actually not identical in meaning. Right. So let me play this 4-minute clip for you that will explain it a little bit more too, so we can see some of the contradictions there.
Could not be a citizen. They said he was not white within the meaning of the statute and therefore not eligible to citizenship. And the court said, well, he's not white because he's not Caucasian, and Caucasians are whites. He did everything right. He learned English. He had a lifestyle that was American. He went to Christian church on Sunday. He dressed as a Westerner. He brought up his children as Americans. He did everything he was supposed to do. And yet he's told that he can't be a citizen because he's not white.
The court ruled that according to the best known science, Ozawa was not Caucasian, but of the Mongolian race. But the court would not be bound by science in policing the boundaries of whiteness. Only 3 months after Ozawa, the court took up the case of Bhagat Singh Thind, a South Asian immigrant and U.S. Army veteran who petitioned for citizenship on the grounds that Indians were of the Aryan or Caucasian race, and therefore white.
And he makes the scientific argument, having learned something actually from the Ozawa case, that he is Caucasian. He gets scientific authority to speak on his behalf that in fact South Asians are included in the Caucasian race.
So here the court was in a bind because they were presented with so-called scientific evidence that Indians were Caucasian. And the court solved this problem by saying that it didn't matter what science said, so-called science. They actually said white is not something that can be scientifically determined, but white is something that is subjectively understood by who they call the common person, the common man.
It may be true, reasoned the court, that the blonde Scandinavian and the brown Hindu have a common ancestor in the dim reaches of antiquity. But the average man knows perfectly well that there are unmistakable and profound differences between them today. The same court that used science to determine whiteness in Ozawa 3 months before now refuted its own reasoning in Thind. Thind might well be Caucasian, the High Court said, but he was not white. The justices never said what whiteness was, only what it wasn't. Their implied logic was a circular one. Whiteness was what the common white man said it was.
The court often decided who was white and who wasn't based on whether they just felt that the person would politically fit well into the kind of society that we were trying to build. And sometimes it was pretty explicit that this is what the court was doing. There was widespread racial views that Asians were undesirable, that they threatened to contaminate the American society. Basically, that Asians are too different, that they can never really become like the rest of us.
So on that note, is how we'll kind of transition very quickly across some time to be able to think, and that was taken from this documentary, by the way. So to transition into thinking about where we are now, just a couple, because we've not then been able to pass anything through legislation, right? We had the Immigration Act of 1924, which began the quota system. So you can look up links to see how many, what it was, I think 2% of the population was allowed to come into the country. But of course, that was not limited towards a lot of Western European countries. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 retained, as it mentioned, reformed some of those discriminatory provisions. But the more important, or where we are now actually, is still in the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. So this is where you can see a shift in the basis of our immigration system from that quota system to now being a percentage of allocation towards family reunification. So when we first started to brainstorm the ways that you can have a path to citizenship, it's mainly through having a family member, and some through employment, and then some through refugees. So that is where you'll see we've kind of been stuck and haven't been able to reform anything from this act. But what I want us to be thinking about is really some of those questions that were brought up with the cases that we just looked at, was how are our policies being, what's guiding them, right? As far as thinking about what we want in citizens and how we perceive that future body of citizens to look like in the United States. So what I'm going to ask you is to think about, is whiteness a factor for naturalization anymore? So I'm gonna give us a couple of minutes to think, and actually, you know what, with time, I want you to make sure that you have time to explore some other resources. So as I'm looking at this, I'm going to go ahead and give you some resources to look at, and we're going to get into small groups to look at this, because I want you to be thinking about this kind of big, compelling question of, well, is that still at play? So what we're going to do is take a look at contemporary U.S. immigration policies, particularly under the Trump administration, when things changed very drastically. And then we'll continue on to think about where we're heading and what's happening. But using the links provided on the next slide, and I promise I will actually share the presentation so that you have all of those. I'm gonna put you into groups, and I want you all to decide in your group, choose one of the segments, so that, you know, it's kind of going to be like a jigsaw where each of you will just choose one to look at, so that then you can present and chat, because it'll be too hard, I think, for you to look at all of the different segments at once. But I want you to be thinking about, you know, when you look at that immigration resource and the data there, think about who is benefiting from that particular type of immigration policy, that path towards citizenship. And so why might it be restricted? So we're going to think about that. And then you can chat in your groups. So again, I'll put you into groups, just 2 groups, decide what you want to look at. And then everybody take at least, 5 to 7 minutes to look at your resources. And I'll let you within your group decide when you all are ready to start chatting about what you've found. And certainly if you are able to see some patterns right away or to consider something, then feel free to explore the other links provided. So here are the different ones. I did not provide information about, I think what was most notorious, right, was building of the wall and also the zero tolerance, which led to family separations, right, at the border. But I've got, the headline bait for you just to get the big idea of what was happening with these particular segments of immigration. And then I've got some links to some data for you to look at. Okay, so I think you'll find it interesting just to see, or hopefully that's why you're in this session, to learn more. But once you get into your group, here are your directions. Once you get into your group, decide if you want to do refugees, asylees, temporary protection status, DACA, and even within the visas, someone could take family-based sponsorship and someone could do employment-based visas. Because I wasn't sure how many people were going to be in our session, I didn't, it was kind of hard to plan for how to allocate, but I'll put you into 2 groups here in just a second, and I will provide the link to the PowerPoint. So let me get out of this. There we go. And I will share. So everyone now has a link to the presentation so that you can get to the links to use. And now I'll put you in groups. Does anybody have any questions before I put you into the groups? First task, decide which group you're going to look at. Second, give each other at least 5 minutes to look at the data, and then you can start chatting within your small group. Okay. So, oh, you know what? Co-host, let's see, do I have? Yeah.
Cool. Well, I will join room 2.
Okay, great.
You're good.
Yeah, because I guess the recording will probably just trace with you wherever you go. But that'll be good because then it'll record at least one of the group's discussions.
Okay.
I think the second group has less people if you want to jump in there.
Okay.
Do you see it there now, Carol?
Yes, I do.
Okay, great.
I think it's slide 14 as well.
Oh. No, that's the whole.
We just need to decide which one we want to do. Which
Wait a minute, that link you gave me was the whole PowerPoint. So we come down to.
slide 14.
Got it. Okay. Well, which do people want to do?
I'll do any of them. So is there any that stick out for anybody else? Like you're passionate about any of those areas?
I'm particularly interested in refugees, but.
You got it.
Refugees works for me.
But we're all doing different ones, aren't we?
Oh,
I thought we were just choosing as a group one and then kind of talking about that and reporting that out.
Right, let's do it.
Yeah.
Let's do refugees.
Refugees, then. Let's see what we got here.
so we're going to look at 3 different documents. Is that right? Each of us, and then talk about them.
We're going to look at the documents under refugees and then talk about it.
Okay. And it looks like there's 3.
Yeah, there weren't very many.
Yeah.
And with some of the data, I think it'll kind of at least jump out at you right away, particularly with the refugees. But then I've supplemented some, if you wanted to learn more about which particular countries they're coming from and numbers and allocations, that type of thing.
Laura said we probably wouldn't have a ton of time to look at these, so I don't know if we want to maybe throw out anything that was jumping out at us.
One of the things that kind of popped out to me, and admittedly I'm going through these quickly, is it looked like, I think in the first article, the larger numbers were for family reunification, maybe, as reason. And then looking at, one thing I thought was interesting, the very last link that's on there, which is has the refugee admissions report. And it has a really good cumulative summary that goes back to 75. That shows where people are coming from, which I think would be interesting.
I'm always struck by just like how few, even the 110,000 or the 125,000 that Biden wants to get to, that just still seems like people are refugees for a reason, you know, and there's, for us to turn our backs on that. But I also found like the highest number was 142,000 in 1993 because of the Balkan Wars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet there are wars like the Balkan Wars occurring in non-white parts of the world that we don't extend we don't expand the limit for. Found that interesting.
Yeah.
Something that stood out to me was the demographic breakdown, and it appears in 2018, 2019, and 2020, there was a significant increase in Christian refugees and a significant decrease in Muslim refugees.
Ah.
Well, I missed that. Yeah.
It was a link at, I think maybe the second article, there was a link for demographic breakdowns.
Okay.
Based on gender, age, religion.
Okay, let's go back and let's look at that. Oh yeah, the report to Congress or the MPI?
Link to a new article. It's called Refugees and Asylees in the United States. Just one second.
Ah, okay, I think I've got it. It's the second one. Okay, okay, I found it. Okay, I didn't see the link.
Well, there's that long list of the high-risk countries, right, that Donald Trump put in. I mean, it crosses there's some interconnectedness, obviously, between race and religion and ethnicity.
Yeah. The quote-unquote shithole countries.
Are
the ones he stopped. It was surprising to me that in 2020, one of the major places that they came from was Ukraine. I did not realize that last year, a substantial number of refugees were from Ukraine.
I didn't realize that either, but man, about putting our own foreign affairs and political agenda first, right?
Yeah.
Did you all get to share each of the segments of what you looked at to kind of share very succinct takeaways of what you noticed in those trends? Okay, the other group was a little bit behind. Did you all have any questions, or did you want me to go over anything real quick? We're going to talk whole group in just a second.
Well, there's a lot here.
There is, and I'd much rather give, I feel like half the battle, right, of finding is just like at least knowing where to go. And so my intention was to take this PowerPoint, look at it another time, or at least know where you can go for some information. And you'll see a lot of the links are to MPI, Migration Policy Institute, and they're just fantastic. So if it's something you want to keep following, I highly recommend getting their newsletters and updates, and they have some fantastic webinars and things like that too. All right, well, I'm going to invite the other group to come back to the whole group too, so we can conclude with a couple quick, a little bit of a discussion afterwards. Thanks.
Brian, I think going back to your point of thinking about refugees due to war, just kind of looking to see the number of military refugees in one of the articles was like a max of 4,000 from Iraq could come. And I just heard recently on NPR this week about the fight to get Afghan refugees here that were translators and military.
I think just yesterday or the day before, Biden raised the number for that.
I think that's right.
But still, I mean, like I would think that at some point there would be no limits, right? Like if there is someone who's going to lose their life, or there's some circumstances that there's no question that we'll accept you and we'll deal with things afterwards.
And that's certainly what's happening right now in Myanmar and the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so,
well, just from that quick glance at the data and what we're seeing, I think when you really look at each piece of the immigration and naturalization or potential paths to naturalization, let's also ask this question: what principles or beliefs are guiding our immigration policies, especially if they can be mainly formed through executive action versus legislation. And so I just wanted to make this connection before we wrap up so that we can have a little bit of a discussion. But thinking back to those Ozawa and Thind cases, what similarities or differences do you see across the last century?
One of the things that I noticed about refugees, because I was very curious about your stat that only 5% of the immigrants coming into the US are refugees, was how restrictive it is. And one of the things that we know, particularly looking at Africa and South America, is that there's a lot of civil wars happening across the world and or incidences of humanitarian crises. So if we're that restrictive, how come we got to be that restrictive? If we are really truly looking to help people, wouldn't we want to expand that? So that's something I thought was very noticeable. And it looks like that hasn't, when I looked at the data, that hasn't changed over a long time. So I appreciated you sharing that.
And in the report, it breaks down, I think they try to justify it as most times refugees want to go back to their home country. So they try to keep them or place them into a country closer in proximity, right? And so the United States is just too far away to bring in the millions of Syrian refugees that Turkey is taking in, right? So Bangladesh, I think, was the next highest after Turkey. So there's, some more information in there too about just other countries and what their refugee numbers are too. So definitely when you see, where we were, where we are now, and that's something that hasn't yet changed under Biden very much, because it is allocated right now, said because of COVID context and things like that. But it'll be something interesting to watch follow. Anybody want to share some other pieces that you're seeing?
Well, several years ago, the US was seen as one of the main receiving countries, and that is no longer the case.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was 110,000 down to 18. And when you look at the factor of religion being a big piece too.
And Laura, you started us out by showing us the importance of race. And I think the recent migrations toward Europe have forced European societies to reckon with their own racist policies.
That's another great global perspective.
France is a good example of that.
Mhm.
What happened to Lady Liberty? Give us you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry, yearning to be free.
But just for a little while. Come
They're
visit, but don't
they're the
stay.
hardest working, I swear.
Well, in fact, we're cutting off our nose to spite our face because the natural growth of population is insufficient to keep the economy going. So we are becoming more and more economically dependent on immigrants. So we will find a way to screw ourselves one way or the other.
So one of the things that I was not clear about from the documents is asylees, and the numbers are for refugees. I gather, are there numbers for asylees?
Yes, in the report, there was one of the pages, I think it was pages 8 and 9, that actually had the numbers of asylum seekers, the number of cases, and the number granted. And when you then look, right now, the asylum process is, on both ends, they will say, I mean, they're just the amount of cases, because that seems to be the only way, because we've limited visas, right? So we've limited all these entering. And so there's a backlog. While about 100,000, I think, have been granted, over 300,000 are still pending. So there's that backlog happening, but that at least gives people, they know that buys them time, because their court cases are going to take years to resolve, which gives them at least some time to, one, they do have a safe place if they have, if they're able to go. But we also know what, Trump was making them stay in Mexico and making Mexico deal a lot with asylum seekers from Central America. So there's that piece of the asylum process. So just each piece of it being more and more difficult. There used to not be an application fee. Now there's a $50 application fee for asylum seekers. So it started to look at that and again, just break down how that is one other angle where, I mean, it was just every aspect of immigration being challenged. I'm trying to think of which other pieces of the asylum seekers to look into, but and then just when you look at the percentages of cases rejected, and one of the headlines I think with Trump was just looking at it, the fear of violence, particularly in El Salvador, was no longer considered a case for being granted asylum. Asylum cases, I think, were actually coming from China, were a lot of them. So I guess the argument, when we put this into context too, just to be thinking about, where we are as a nation and the increasing racial and ethnic diversity of our nation, this is at least just puts into context perhaps what the agenda was in immigration. So when we see that, in immigration law, that race is not a factor through all of these other executive orders and actions, that I think you could argue that we are trying to preserve the whiteness, or the administration was trying to preserve the whiteness of the country in any shape or form that they could, as far as immigration and citizenship status. So just the context to be thinking about. I know we just have a couple minutes. I was going to say, with if this, really being a lesson or assessment, if you're gonna, task your students authentically, either have them role play as a constituent to write a letter. Certainly we should all be doing this anyway, contacting in some shape or form as this legislation is being deliberated. As a member of Congress, how could we actually seek bipartisan legislation? And so maybe by trying to argue a compelling vision of what you see the future of the United States and its citizenry to be about. might be a place to have students write, especially to be thinking about, well, then what is driving? Because if it's not just a threat to who's going to be voting and maintaining power, then, you know, that's certainly what is at risk for some legislators, right? Is thinking about, will they be able to maintain their power if our demography is shifting so much?
Laura, this was excellent. Would I be able to share your PowerPoint with a student
course.
who's writing on immigration?
Of course, yeah. You have the links, I think. So, I mean, feel free to share, use any of that.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, on to the next, right?
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura.
Thanks y'all for such active
That's great,
participation.
Laura.
Thank you, thank you.
Thanks for the resources too.
Mhm.